Exploring a topic that was new to me. When I've done science and faith in the past, I had not actually explored this particular aspect of science and its relationship with faith. The two books that you see on the screen are two that I would highly recommend. I looked at a lot of material, but this particular man, Martin Rudwick, you can Google him and find out a lot about him. His bona fides are about as good as they get. He's a historian, science historian, particularly in the area of geology and fossils and things of that matter. He's written multiple books, many scientific papers. His original book was called Bursting the Limits of Time. This is of the N.T. Wright category in terms of it is probably close to 3.5, 4 inches thick. 1,000 pages, and it is, it's just a tome. He came back this year and took the material from that book and put it in a book called Earth's Deep History, How It Was Discovered and Why It Matters. And this is the primary source that I'll be using for the presentation tonight. That is a very easy book to read. It is not super long, 200 and something pages. It is also a delight to read, and it's just a marvelous journey through all kinds of information. So tonight, what we're going to be looking at, we're starting 5 weeks in a row of just doing aspects of science, and particularly the interface with faith and religion. And I did not realize that there was such a close connection between geology and faith. It's not one of the traditional flashpoints, but an interesting story. So let's start with something you know. We've all heard of the idea that the world was created in 4004 BC. It may not be something you believe, but you know that belief is out there. And we probably also know that this is one of the classic areas of conflict between faith and science, especially with biblical literalists and fundamentalists who take the creation story as factual history. For example, this is one of the dioramas from what's called the Creation Museum. And we have there a velociraptor and a cave woman in the same scene. So from this particular theological stance, viewing history in that kind of way. On the other hand, we have some militantly anti-religious people, some of whom are in the scientific community, who use that dating of 4004 BC as a way of attacking the faith and attacking religion in general. Both groups, at either extreme, assert that we have to choose between science and faith. One is right, one is wrong, that there's a winner and a loser. So for example, this poster comes from the scientific community. We got Charles Darwin up there with various human skulls, and then various skulls showing the progressive development of the sort of the genealogical background of the human race. And of course, the caption is evolution, we have the fossils, we win. Subtext, religion, you lose. Now, there's a story that I want to tell you tonight, and it's the story that Rudwick tells in his book. It's the story that lies behind this perceived conflict. And I, for one, did not know this story. And my hunch is few, if any of us, have ever heard this story. It's a story that takes us into the sciences of geology and paleontology, some of the later sciences to develop. And it's going to take us into a concept, something known as deep time, or sometimes, as in Rudwick's book, referred to as deep history. Now, like a lot of topics, there's a myth that underlies the dating of creation to 4004 BC. It's a myth that is perpetuated by some on the science side, as well as some from the religious community. We're going to use this story of how this date of 4004 came to be to begin our journey into deep time and geology and the study of fossils. The idea that the world was created in 4004 BC did not exist until well over a century after the Reformation. This is not a biblical concept. This is not an early church concept, medieval concept, Reformation concept. This idea of this kind of dating is a relatively recent kind of thing. We know exactly where and when this idea emerged thanks to people like Rudwick. So here's the story. In 1654, Archbishop James Ussher of Ireland published a massive history of the world. It was a tome called The Annals of the World. You can still buy it out there. In this history, he dated creation, and here's what he had to say. This work of creation took place, and man, humanity, was created by the Trinity on October 23rd, 4004 BC at 9 o'clock in the morning. Barbara's laughing. I'm thinking some of you are too. Ussher also calculated that Adam and Eve were driven out of paradise on Monday, November the 10th, 4004 BC, and that the ark touched down on Mount Ararat on May 5th, 2348 BC on a Wednesday. Now, if we can stop laughing for a second, there's three things that stand out about this dating that we need to really consider, and they're not laughing matters because they play a huge role in archaeology. in geology and paleontology. The first was that this dating assumes that you can date things in the world using the Bible as your primary or your only resource. Second, that according to his calculations, the world is simply not that old. The creation of the universe only happened about 6,000 years ago. Third, a literal reading of Genesis implied that everything that had been created was created at the same time, in other words, in 1 week. And you may remember in that Genesis 1 creation story, humans are created first, and then God presents the animals to Adam as he names them. So everything's from 1 week, including us. Meaning that there was no history of the world prior to the existence of humans. So just keep those three things in mind. All three of these turn out to have a profound impact on the development of the sciences of geology and the sciences of paleontology. And I want to walk you through this story. In 1701, Ussher's dating was incorporated into the King James Bible, where it remained there until 1885. And actually, there are some forms of the King James Bible today that if you look over on the side, you can still see, there's like over here, it says 710 years, and then 4004 is when the creation happens at the beginning. For many, putting this number or this dating into the Bible text itself made Ussher's dating seem like scripture. It was in the Bible. Now, today, this dating is the basis of what is called young earth creationism. And it is this dating, 4004 BC, that has run into conflict with science, specifically the sciences of geology and paleontology, and their dating of the earth and their dating of humankind. And here is where the myth comes into play. The myth put forward by some within the scientific community, particularly from those who have an axe to grind against religion, is that since Ussher was an archbishop, it's just obvious that this absolutely ludicrous dating of the creation of the world was religiously motivated. And that this dating is just one more example of why thinking people and people of science should reject religion. And you may have read some books where this argument is made. It's been made in many books. Stating that the 4004 BC debate is just another sample of silly religious belief and therefore can be discounted. As a result, many have ridiculed both Ussher and the date of 4004 BC. But this narrative I've just laid out for you is a myth. It turns out that this whole thing is a myth that has long been abandoned by historians like Martin Rudwick. According to historians, the story is different, and the story is even stranger than the myth. Ussher's dating of creation was not based on any religious conviction, and he was not trying to establish the date of creation, and he was not trying to bolster the authority of the Bible. People just assume that because he was an archbishop. That was not his intent. What gets lost in the myth was that Ussher was one of the leading scientists of his day, of the 17th century, the 1600s. He was also one of the leading historians of that century. What he was attempting to do was to create an accurate history of the world, scientifically. His dating of creation represented state-of-the-art science in the 1600s. This is something that gets lost. It was calculated using the best sources known at the time. Ussher was not the only one trying to do this. Just give you a couple of samples. In the wake of the Enlightenment and its concern with history and facts, there are over 140 published estimates of the age of the Earth. By the way, they all essentially wind up within about a 10-year period of each other. Isaac Newton was one of these. Newton concluded that the world was created in 4000 BCE, 4 years different from the earlier deal. Johannes Kepler, who formulated the laws of planetary motion that we still use today, was another person who tried to date the age of the universe. Kepler's calculation was that the creation of the universe occurred in 3992. So, these three are close, just not quite the same. The reason that all of these dates from the period were so close to each other is that all of them were drawing on the same resource, which was the book of Genesis. And that probably shocks us living in the 21st century. But at the time, the Bible was thought to be the only document that actually went back to the beginning of time. The Bible, and specifically the book of Genesis, was considered a dependable and a historically valid document. People had great respect for the ancients and for their writings, like Aristotle and others. Ancient sources were considered solid sources of knowledge, not just solid, definitive. This included the Bible as one of the ancient documents. Now, it may be difficult for us today to believe this, but the Bible, and specifically the book of Genesis, were taken seriously by scientists and others as historical documents. No one had a reason to doubt its narrative. And there was nothing in the science of the time that suggested otherwise. In Genesis, the non-human world of nature was seen kind of as a backdrop. It was simply the setting for the human drama. It did not have its own narrative. So the world of nature was not seen as having a history of its own. Well into the 1700s, everyone, and I mean everyone, took it for granted that humanity and the earth were the same age, just as Genesis said they were. This is the background to Ussher and others dating the creation of the world to around 4000 BC. At the time, his dating of 4004 was accepted as good science. Ironically, at the same time that Ussher and others were using the best science of the age to build its history of the earth, Isaac Newton and the others, some, though, were beginning to see reasons why the science of the day might need to be questioned. It was not certain, but there's some hints out there. The science of geology was created because there were hints in nature, nothing definitive, but there were hints that the world might be older than people thought. Geology and paleontology both deal with something known as deep time. Time that extended beyond the accepted dating of the universe of around 6,000 years ago. So deep time was the term created for the time prior to the accepted date of creation 6,000 years ago. The science of deep time emerged in the 1600s and the 1700s, and it emerged in dialogue with the accepted science of the day, science based on the Bible, and in particularly the Genesis creation stories. Geology, like all other sciences, and this is a well-documented fact, well accepted in the science textbooks, rose out of a scriptural view of history. Unlike most cultures, the biblical tradition has a linear sense of time, holding the idea that there's a past, there is a present, and there is a future. Time had a beginning, and time is moving towards a goal. Most cultures in the world were called eternalist, did not have a sense of history, did not have a sense of beginning and end. The idea of history, that the world has a unique starting point and has a linear direction, first emerged in Judaism and then is extended to Christianity. During the early 1600s, some were starting to be aware that there was evidence within nature itself that the world just possibly might be older than we thought it was. But the evidence is hard to accept. I mean, what do you do with a fossil like that? And yet, it's there. We need to deal with it. Here's how it started. Scientists began to notice that seashells were found far from the sea. Well, that's odd. They were even found far above the sea, so that even on some of the highest mountains in the world, you can find seashells. And that is odd. Now, in the 1660s, fossils were also found of creatures unlike any that we know today, meaning they were extinct. And even the idea that things could be extinct was a novel idea. This meant that all creatures were not created during the same week, contrary to how we'd been reading the Genesis story. Some creatures had come, existed, and gone, and others were still here. In addition, sedimentary strata on the rocks indicated that the sediment was deposited over vast amounts of time. And when you begin to look at the sediment, some interesting things come out. In the different strata, this is an artist's sort of rendition that gives you the idea, you have entirely different kinds of fossils. Some of sea creatures, some of land animals. Now, this is the same spot, but you can actually have this same spot was actually under an ocean, and then it was above land, and then it was under an ocean again, and it was above land again, and this can happen several times in a row. Some strata even folded and stood vertical. Now that requires even more time. So we're getting hints here that maybe 6,000 years is not going to cut it. At first, these discoveries were interpreted scientifically in terms of the best existing science of the day, which happened to be the biblical flood of Noah. Remember, the Bible is still being thought of as a definitive historical text. And interpreting these things in terms of the flood does make a certain kind of sense. Noah's flood could account for shells far from the sea. It could even account for shells far above the sea. It seemed like a natural explanation. Even better, it accounted for the empirical data. That's what science does. You come up with a hypothesis. With the hypothesis, you want it to do two things. One is explain and the other is predict. Well, this could explain. It's a plausible explanation. Another reason for not challenging the existing 6,000-year timeline was that with fossils, it is not always clear whether they were living at one time or not. There were non-organic rocks called dendrites. And when you look at them, they look very similar to things that are alive. So how do you tell the difference? So fossils might only look like they're the remains of living things. In addition, it was hard to believe that some fossils had ever been living. I mean, they were just so strange and so different from anything living today. Now, we know that that's a Triceratops. But in the 1600s, what do you do with something like that? It doesn't conform to any known life form. Could it possibly have ever been living? Fossils, it was thought, could be a geological Rorschach test. In other words, that we were projecting onto inert rocks images of that they might have been a living thing at some point. From 1650 to about 1750, science debated whether fossils had ever been living things, pro and con, back and forth. But the evidence, as people did research, got out in the field, the evidence was mounting and mounting and mounting. 1667, Niels Stenson, one of the early, very famous archaeologists or geologists, studied fossils referred to as tongue stones. Well, to many, these stones look like tongues, and they were made of stone. This is how they got the name. But they also were identical to shark's teeth. Only nobody had ever seen a shark's tooth remotely close to this size. Stenson concluded that they were indeed fossilized teeth, but from monster sharks no longer found on the earth. Another indication that species had gone extinct. And that over time, these teeth had been turned into stone, which, by the way, takes a lot of time. Stenson also made an extensive study of rock strata. He observed that the rocks at the lowest levels had no fossils. They're igneous rocks, volcanic in origin, whereas the upper rocks, which are sedimentary, are the rocks that had the fossils. And the fossils were different at the different strata within the rock. In the 1660s, Robert Hooke used an early microscope to study fossils. He could see cell structures inside fossils, especially those of plants. Now, in order for plants to be fossilized, a large amount of time would have had to have passed. But neither Stenson, nor Hooke, nor anybody else questioned the traditional time scale of 6,000 years. They simply assumed that all these things have lived during the same time period that humans have been on Earth the last 6,000 years. But things were changing. People were beginning to become aware that you could reconstruct past history using rocks and using fossils. Rocks and fossils were evidence of ancient changes in nature. But this continued to be interpreted in the context of the biblical narrative, the Noah story. 1665, interesting story. A fossilized skeleton was found that was thought to be that of a man. Wasn't, but they thought it was. It was labeled Homo devuli testis. Okay, what does that mean? The skeleton of a witness of the flood and a divine messenger. Now, this is a scientific naming of what was thought to be a human skeleton. But slowly, the biblical flood began to be seen as an inadequate explanation for what was being discovered. And that's going to force people to begin to think outside the box. Noah's flood lasted only 40 days. and 40 days could hardly account for everything that was being discovered. Fossils created a couple of problems for the traditional and biblical dating of the world. First, they showed progressive development, and that takes a lot of time. An animal that changes into an animal that changes into an animal that changes into an animal, and so down the road. Second, that some of the animals, like this one here, had become extinct. Extinct animals meant that not everything was created at the same time, and that the 6 days of creation was not enough time to account for what we were beginning to see. The biblical timeline, which was the accepted standard, even the accepted scientific standard, is going to need some reinterpretation. We needed to somehow fit the new data, people thought, into the existing timeline based on Genesis. They weren't willing to get rid of the timeline of Genesis, but you got to fit the new data in. Well, let's get creative. The first step was to reinterpret the 6 days of creation story to represent 6 periods of time instead of just 6 24-hour days. So the days are like eras or epochs. But still, there was nothing that seemed to demand the lengthening of the time scale itself, or doing away with the 6,000-year timeline taken from the Bible. And again, all of this is within the scientific community. This is not in the church. Early in the 1700s, numerous people, including Edmund Halley of the Halley's Comet fame, began thinking the unthinkable, thinking of extending the boundaries of time beyond the traditional limit of 6,000 years. 1778, Georges Louis Leclerc, the Comte of Buffon, added a 7th period to the scheme of 6 days. This was the period when humans were alive. Now, what this scheme did is it puts the first 6 epochs, or the first 6 days, or most of the Earth's history, as a pre-human era. This was a bold move. It went against both the accepted science of the day as well as the Genesis timeline. To do this meant that the time scale had to be lengthened far beyond the traditional 6 millenniums. During the late 1700s, we finally begin to see enlargements of the time scale. James Hutton, another famous geologist, made a detailed study of rock strata. He believed that as you looked at the layers of strata, some with fossils, some without, layers of sediment, some tilted, some eroded, that this was evidence of, in his words, former worlds, pre-Genesis worlds. Georges Cuvier argued that the distinctive array of fossils found in successive strata indicated that the Earth had to be much more than 6,000 years old. The period from 1780 to 1860 is known as the Geological Revolution. On the right, you can see pretty much the time deal as we understand it now, and that much of this emerged during this time frame. This revolution was analogous to the Copernican revolution. The Copernican revolution dealt with the immensity of space and our place within it. The geological revolution dealt with the immensity of time and our space within it. Jean-Henri Deluc coined the term geology for the study of the physical evidence of the history of the Earth. Fossils, as we enter the 1800s, came to be seen as relics of nature. This meant that fossils could be used to date things in the past, just like you could coins. Strata in the rocks were seen as nature's archives. Strata of sediment, known as varves, were like tree rings. They would give you specific information at each layer. The same was true of ice cores, although that develops later. Ice cores could be read like tree rings or layers of sediment. Today, we go to Antarctica, take ice cores because we can tell us about the past of our planet. Some fossils were in ancient lakes and seabeds with things that no longer existed. This was another indicator that vast amounts of time had transpired. There was evidence that animals did indeed evolve, transmuting from one form to another. On the right, you see it's equus. This is the horse. And by looking at various fossils over various time frames, they've been able to determine that the horse started out, as far as we can tell, about the size of a cat. And over time it evolved. But all the bone structure and all the indicators there is that this is a connected development. In other words, this is the backdrop to the horse that we have today. Evidence of extinction negated the idea that everything was created at the same time. It's only in the 1800s that scientists finally abandoned using the Bible as a dating tool. That is very recently. The great breakthrough that changes everything in geology and enables us to make quantum leaps forward is the dating of rocks that we got from new technology emerging from physics at the turn of the 20th century. In 1903, X-rays were discovered, and this opened the door to understanding radioactive decay, with isotopes of an element decaying from one form into another. 1907, Bertram Boltwood pioneered the new science of radiometric dating. Radiometric dating of rocks was a game changer, giving us a natural chronometer. You can just run it and get dates. If you knew the strata the rock was from, and if you knew the rate of decay of certain elements, you could calculate the age of the rock with quite a bit of accuracy. The result of all this is that dramatic increase of the time scale. You can see over here, this is how the chart works today. You know, of the 4.6 billion years on the Earth, most of it is Precambrian, that's pre-life. Life only comes in about 540 million years ago. And then you can see all this. Well, all of this information, by the way, emerges first out of geology. And we're able to map the history of the Earth, its rocks and its fossils, with this degree of accuracy. Carbon dating, which is one of the tools that's used in radiometric dating, would allow you to go back 50,000 years using organic material. And there, you probably know this, but carbon, nitrogen, anyway, that's a very accurate, but it's limited, about 50,000 years. Using other elements such as beryllium or potassium, you could go back much further in time. You could go back millions of years or billions of years. Uranium-238 that decays to lead-207 could be used to date things back to 4.5 billion years. What they're working with is what's called the half-life, the rate of decay. How much of the original parent element is there and how much of the daughter element there. You can actually measure those two things. And from that, you can determine how old that sample is. And 4.5 billion years, by the way, is the age of the solar system. Now, lutetium can be used to date things going back 37.1 billion years ago. You can also see three others there have long time frames. Since the universe is believed to be only 13.8 billion years old, lutetium can be used to date anything that exists in our universe, without exception. By 1953, we could date the oldest rocks on Earth, date the Earth to 4.5 billion years, dating it still stands. As you see the sign there, at that point, 3.8 billion years. You can actually go in Massachusetts, go visit that site where that rock is and stand on one of the oldest things in our solar system. Here's an interesting story. January 2020, this year, radiometric dating was used on the Murchison meteorite. Murchison's a famous geologist that's named after him. It's a meteorite that fell in Australia in 1969. And they're using this new technology today. Well, how old is this thing? It's been in space. It's been determined that the Murchison meteorite is over 7 billion years old. That's hard scientific dating. That's 2.5 billion years older than the age of our solar system. So this has been floating around in space before our sun even existed. Amazingly, when they looked at this meteorite, they found it full of the basic building blocks of life. You'll get this PowerPoint later, but if you look over there, amino acids, lipids, you just run the deal there. Pretty much everything you need to make life was found in a meteorite of something that is 7 billion years old. This has tremendous implications about life being widespread in the universe. More recent developments in the area of plate tectonics and continental drift. Early in the 20th century, evidence began to emerge that the continents were not stationary. They, in fact, were moving. The continents were floating on a denser material of the Earth's mantle. Now, seismology is actually, sending waves down, has actually confirmed this, and we confirmed it other ways too. First known as mobilism, this movement over the crust by the continents later came to be known as continental drift. Mobilism was based on what's called convection of the mantle. It's fluid, not it's by our standards it's very, very thick, but it's fluid in the sense it moves. And then you have convection currents in that mantle where things rise and things fall. Mobilism was proposed in the year 1915, but it's not accepted until really near the end of the 1960s. It was also noticed that the continents lined up together as if they might once have been a single continent. This was reinforced, but you put the continents together and you start looking at fossils and climates and dating them, and you suddenly find, yeah, look at the color coding there. Does appear these things, in fact, were connected. There were also fossils of tropical forests found in Antarctica and fossils indicating cold environments found near the equator, indicating continents have been moving. Later, we began to find evidence that the continents were still moving. This is a picture that Barbara and I took when we were in Iceland. This is actually two continental plates splitting on the island of Iceland. You can actually, go back and forth between two continental plates. There are places, literally, like Iceland, where you can actually physically see this. And it's moving at the rate of so many inches a century. You can also see it in the sea, as the plates are literally cracking and pulling apart from each other. We also discovered places like the mid-oceanic ridge, where the continents were separating. There are other places where the plates collide and slide under each other, something that we know today as subduction. By the end of the 1960s, the evidence for continental drift was simply overwhelming. Look at this map. We find coastal swamp, desert sand, salt deposits, fossil reefs, signs of glaciation, desert, and tropics. And look how they line up. And that lets you know kind of how the continents were at one point. The evidence included the evidence for this included the physics of plate tectonics, the geology of the rocks, the biology of the fossils, all these things adding in. Today, we actually use GPS to measure continental drift all over the globe, in terms of how many inches, or actually they do it by millimeters, it's metric. How many millimeters a year everything on the earth is moving. So I thought you might like to see a map. This is what the map indicates. These are actually being measured. It's roughly about 25 millimeters a year that this stuff is moving, but it's moving. The continents are drifting. And from that, you can project forward what it might look like at some point in the future. Another tool that's recently been added to the tool belt is what's called Paleomagnetism. This can give you the actual latitude where the rock was formed. I'd never heard of this. It was fascinating. When igneous rock, when volcanic rock is formed with heat and it cools, it crystallizes, especially if it has iron in it, the crystals align magnetically with the Earth's magnetic poles. Using this, we can determine that rocks are now thousands of miles away from where they were formed, particularly in terms of they've moved north or they've moved south. Shifts in magnetism are like the red shift that we see in space. You can work backward and determine not only when a rock had been formed, but where it had been formed. Immensely powerful tool for understanding the continents. This technique was used as evidence of continental drift. For example, here in the mid-oceanic ridge, you have, as it separates, the lava's coming out, and then as other lava comes out, it pushes that lava aside to two sides. And over time, you can see these three pictures, you get different deals. Well, you can measure by measuring radiometrically the age of the rocks, and what you suddenly find out is the age of the rocks mirrors each other on both sides. Proof of continental drift. Specifically because you've got alternating magnetism shows up in both sides. One of the interesting things here is that we know, for example, that the magnetic poles of the Earth switch every so often. And that data actually shows up in the rocks themselves. The science of oceanography has given us another tool that we can use mapping ancient environments. Using what's called the TEX 86 method, this is a paleothermometric method. It's only been in use since 2002. We can map the temperatures of ancient oceans from the isotopes of oxygen in the fossil organisms. The isotopes of oxygen vary depending on the ocean temperature at the time. So as you measure in fossils various levels of the oxygen, what you're measuring is what the temperature of the ocean was when that fossil was formed. Now, the results of all this tonight is that we have now mapped deep time. We don't know everything, of course, but we have infinitely more knowledge than we had even a century ago. We've extended time from the 6,000 year calculation based on Genesis to 4.5 billion years here on Earth. And in at least one case, we've mapped it back 7 billion years. By the way, there is nothing in tonight's presentation that is incompatible with our biblical faith or with God as the Creator. Circling back to where we began, to the embracing of the date of 4004 BC for creation, that has nothing to do with religion. Never did. Those who embrace this dating today and those who argue with him over this dating are both arguing out of an out-of-date science from the 1600s and not anything central to our faith. We can do better. We can do better in science, and we can do better in faith. Next week, we'll be moving on to Einstein, but